If you're joining us for the first time, I'm Simon Osman. I want to welcome you to the Who I Became podcast, where each week I'll interview a guest who will share a personal story that will educate, inform and inspire. Now today's episode is part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Sammy Wanyonyi, who is the founder of Merge Twin Cities, bringing cultures together to create a positive change in Minnesota and beyond. And in part 1, Sammy shared how, having never been able to speak English, he was touched by the Holy Spirit one day and instantly spoke the King's English. If you haven't listened to that story, go back and check out episode 33 and take a listen. Now today, Sammy's going to share more of his experiences as a man of colour emigrating to America and how he's now perceived back home in Africa. He's going to share insight with you as to what it's like having a multicultural family here in America. Now will you join me as we dive into this week's conversation with Dr. Sammy Wanyonyi in what I've titled A Vision in Africa Became a Reality in America. Really good to be joined again, my friend. I know in part 1 we spoke about how you were sort of in your village one day and you were sort of, the Holy Spirit came over you and you couldn't speak English, but all of a sudden you could speak English or native tone. So what I would say, this is a second part conversation. If you haven't listened to that story, it's incredibly powerful. Go back and listen to that first podcast again. But we're going to dive straight in, Sammy, now to some content about your time here in America. So with me being a black English guy and you, I guess technically now you're African American.
Technically I am African American.
You are African American, so I've got it, yeah. So let's talk about some of your experiences. So you arrived here as a black man from East Africa.
Correct.
A very small, humble beginnings, where you sort of got your master's, you got your doctorate. What are some of your experiences like as being a sort of black man in America, particularly when you first arrived? Maybe let's start there, Sammy.
Yeah, I mean, I had multiple experiences. For one, when you're new in a place, there's so much stuff happening and things moving so fast that sometimes you miss out on details of what is going on. And only in hindsight do you look back and go, oh, wow, what was that? Yeah. And so, right now I do have the gift of hindsight after having been here for over 20 years now. But when I first arrived, as a black man, arriving in America for the first time, I had certain expectations. Looking at America from a distance, there was always this thinking that, everybody has a gun in the street and, what we see in the movies.
Yes, yeah.
Then I got here and I realized that's for the movies. It's not reality. And so I had to quickly adjust. And then, when I first arrived, Minnesota was pretty white. There were not many, people of color, and still largely today, but, it's increasingly more diverse.
Yeah, I think still now, just to interject, Sammy, I think it's still less than like 3% of the population here is sort of black or foreign.
I think for Minnesota, I mean, it's increasingly diverse now, and which is part of the reason, in fact, we started Merge Twin Cities because there is about 30% of the Twin Cities population, for example, over 30%, they are people of diverse backgrounds. But at that point, it wasn't as much as diverse, and coming in from Africa, I expected that, but at the same time, it's still, a little bit different being in this context where you are the one guy standing out. And so there was always this sensitivity, also, to my environment. I had, kids in school who were curious about, of course, me and whether I saw things the same way. I remember sitting across, the table from this young lady, during one of my lunch hours, and she came, sat on the other end, and she engaged me in conversation, which I appreciated a lot, because I was still new and not a whole lot knowing. But as she was talking to me, and then she began to cry, she's like, it's so different, talking to you too, I realized, I've always been told that Black people are these and Black people are these and Black people are these. And then talking to you, I realized that, it's not the case. And she was crying. And I was surprised. I wasn't expecting her to be crying. And I didn't know the details of what she had been told as a kid. And in fact, I was shocked because I'm thinking, of course, a Black person, even in America, is different from a Black person in Africa because they're two different cultures. And so here, to this young lady, there was this generalized thinking that, all Black people are the same. And I'm talking to this one, and so they're all good. Or rather, I'm getting a different impression from what I was told. But I know from experience and from reality that, people are different, and it has nothing to do with the color of our skin and all of that. We each have our own uniqueness and our own individuality. So that initial experience was a little bit, surprising and shocking to me. And then I remember being at this one church and my very first church I went to, I went there the first Sunday and nobody really came to talk to me much, and then the second Sunday I went back and still, at the end of the service, I was just kind of standing there by myself and I'm the only Black guy, kid in the room. The third Sunday I went back and, I had this guy come up to me and he said, it's good to have you here, but you know what? We have other churches in the inner city where you might be, more comfortable.
I go to that Black church, or what are you doing here? Just making sure you're in the right place.
Yeah.
We're eating cucumber sandwiches and drinking English tea and stuff there. So,
yeah. So that was it shocked me for one, because I was thinking I'm not here because I'm looking for Blackness. I'm here because I'm looking for Christ.
Yeah.
And Christ. It's our identity in Christ that binds us together. And so right away, I realized that, there are certain things, racial things that are going through people's minds that for me at that point, it wasn't a conscious thing that I was going through. But then from then, I also kind of decided intentionally that I'm going to cross the barriers and I'm going to reach out. And so the next time I was actually going out looking for the people. I realized that nobody was going to come to me. I'm going to go, and I'm going to reach out.
And it's interesting you say it because very similar when I grew up in England in a very sort of white middle class area. And I think there were some days, honestly, I wouldn't even know I was Black. If someone would say, they'd call me Black, I'm like, who are they talking about?
What are you talking about?
Yeah. So it is those narratives in your own perception, isn't it?
Exactly.
That, God didn't create different nationalities, he just created Christ followers. So, it's interesting how it comes about. And I think the key word in it is like narrative that we're hearing. It's a very common buzzword right now. All of that gal has she's been given a different sort of narrative. But an interesting play maybe, Sammy, is what did your family think about when you came to America? I mean, were you, even back in maybe the sort of the 90s when this was, were they saying, oh, Sammy, you've changed, you're different now, you become an American? I mean, how did you have any barriers between friends and family back in Africa against your new life here in the US?
Well, obviously, there were changes. When I first came, the cell phone wasn't, easy. And for 2 years, I didn't really communicate with people back in Africa. There was no way of doing that. I had no money. I had nothing. And phone calls were too expensive to make. We didn't have email readily. And so I never, I wrote a letter maybe once or twice to communicate that I arrived safely and things were moving okay. And so those 2 years of being isolated before I eventually went back, at first I didn't realize I had changed a lot until I went back after the 2 years. And then I experienced this reverse culture shock. For one, when you have moved, you don't realize it, or you're not consciously thinking about it, but people are changing and you are changing, unconsciously. And so when you meet, there has to be this process of reorientation. And so when I went back the first time after those 2 years, I realized, hey, I have to re-enter. And they also realized that they had to quickly readjust to me, and they were telling me I had changed. I was like, I didn't realize that. So yeah.
Yeah, and that is interesting because just that concept of having to change to the environment, it just does sort of show very strong cultural things that go on in our life about the environment that we might not see. And I know that I've spoken to a few people in Australia, a big sort of melting pot there, and they say, I could be an Italian Australian, but then I go to Italy and they say you're not Italian. And then I'm in Australia and say, you're not Australian. And it was a gentleman I spoke to who's from Lebanon and moved to Australia when he was 8 or 9, maybe similar.
Yeah.
But it was sort of journey to you. And he says, but, I'm sort of trapped between these two identities because no one will really recognise who I am. So it is fascinating. What about relationships as well? I mean, very much, me and you could be brothers, Sammy. Really could. We're similar life, but my wife is also, white. Your wife is white.
Yeah.
What about, never mind this sort of the American perception, maybe a different angle. Yeah. What was the perception of friends and family back in Kenya and the rest of Africa that you married a white woman? How did that go down?
I've never thought about it too seriously, but I know that it's it changes people's perception because visually they realize, that there's this consciousness that, there must be some barriers. And so they have to navigate those differences and those adjustments. And I think naturally for my family, that was sort of a part of the experience. Now, they were excited, that, I was getting married. And of course, they understood that I was in a different environment and my social relationships had taken me in a different direction to meet, this girl that was a different race from my own, and then finding our common identity in Christ, and then growing together in this relationship that eventually leads to marriage. But as with any family, there is always adjustments to make. But in our case, of course, just being the fact that I had grown up in Africa and she's grown up in America, there's a big difference there, a huge gap. Now, I had the advantage of having been in America already for over 10 years at that point when we were getting married. And so I understood the culture well. But my wife hadn't lived in Africa. Now, she had been, a short-term missionary here and there, but she hadn't lived in Africa. And so she had to adjust significantly to me. And even when we journeyed to Africa, I realized that, we had to take a slower pace than I was used to. And she had to adjust quite a bit, in engaging with the culture and the people and the communities and the family, those family dynamics.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like I said, I keep joking that me and you could be brothers, we're very similar, but there's a real mindset to a lot of this because even with my wife, I think here in the US, the term is you're in a biracial relationship, is what we sort of say, it's like...
which we don't think consciously about, because we're just...
I think that's when me and you just say the same. I'm like, my wife is my wife, my children, and maybe other people make more of a big deal about this than what we do. But I think there's a real mindset, like I said, surrounding understanding maybe the type of people me and you are, that it doesn't bother us, it doesn't faze us. This is just us and our relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess having the American term, the biracial children and stuff as well. I mean, have you sort of come across any issues or obstacles with your children? I mean, where do they relate most to being African, American, trapped in the middle?
Well, at this point, they're still little, and so my oldest is 10, and the next one is 9 and 5, and so they're beginning, of course, to wrestle with their own question of identity, who they are. I remember, like my youngest, we ask him, what color are you? He's like, I'm white, and you ask my other one, what color are you? I'm black or I'm brown, so, and so they're kind of wrestling through all of these experiences, kind of trying to discover their own identity in the process. But in terms of, just them knowing, who they are, at least in our home, in our family, I think the steady environment and the security that they find in the parents provides great foundational reality for them. And so they relate with people from all sides. Of course, our neighborhood it's mainly white. We are the one multicultural family in the neighborhood. Everybody else is pretty much white, except actually just 2 weeks ago, we had a neighbor move in, and they are, an interracial marriage as well, Nigerian and American. So now we have two families that are actually neighbors, which is fascinating.
You're taking over, Sammy. That's
Yeah, so I'm curious, to get to know my neighbor from that perspective. But my kids are very comfortable in any environment. We engage with a lot of the African community in the Twin Cities, and of course we live in a very white neighborhood as well. And whichever way we go, they're very comfortable. They eat food from all places and all ankles, and they love it. They love the African food that I make in the home, and they love all the Italian and German and everything else. And so they are very blessed. To have a very global perspective, and they're eager to learn other languages. They're trying to learn English. as French, they're trying to learn Swahili, and so sometimes I confuse them and speak different other languages because I speak 5 languages.
Yeah, wow.
So then
I struggle with English. Same with listeners to my podcast. And what about when we sort of look at immigrants that come to America, and I call myself one of those. It seems a bit strange to sort of say that, but they can be, with where we are in 2020 with George Floyd and race relations. There's a lot of deep conversations going on right now. But I think there needs to be more of a general understanding that most immigrants that come to the US are very blessed in the opportunities that it provides. And obviously, both me and you are from very poor, humble backgrounds. You actually just trumped me there on the poverty scale, Sammy. But I guess, what has America afforded you, Sammy, that you wouldn't have had in Africa?
Well, I think for one, I count my true wealth as being a follower of Christ, and in engaging with the American church, for me, it's been a huge blessing. For one, it broadened my own spiritual understanding and gave me a deeper knowledge and wisdom and broadening of my Christian journey. And for me, that's the truest wealth. My relationship with God, and God hasn't changed. He's only expanded my understanding of Him through this engagement with the American Christians, and of course the generosity in the American church is tremendous. Not that there isn't generosity in the African context, because there is, and many times people sacrifice their last meal, to be a blessing. But I've also seen that great generosity here in the church, and that has been a tremendous blessing. But at a personal level, of course, right now, living a very middle class life, it's day and night from my environment where I grew up. Having a beautiful home, a beautiful wife. I have food at my table, abundance compared to when I grew up, and then sometimes I look at the people still going through some of the villages, back in the villages in Africa, and the scarcity and all of that. And I go, God, I'm really blessed, and I'm grateful for being here in America. Now, of course, in the midst of the blessing, I want to be a blessing as well. So I have initiatives that I have in Africa to be a blessing to that village, whether it's helping with the school, helping, extended family members, educating kids and all of that. And so, it's a privilege that I have, and being in America is a great privilege, and being especially able to partner with the church in America from all across the divide. The white church and the African American church and the ethnic churches, that are anchored in the immigrant communities, all of them working together. It's a huge blessing. And then, just being here serving the city. As I mentioned, we have this initiative called Merge Twin Cities, where we are working with the churches from all across ethnic backgrounds, over 100 different ethnic backgrounds, to minister to the city and to reach people in these ethnic enclaves with the message and the love of Christ, and seeing God's grace help us to be able to work together in a very divided environment, bringing a message of hope and reconciliation that bridges the gap, even, with the African American and the Anglo or the white American and the, Latino American or the Filipino American, the Hmong American, the Hispanic American. It's a true blessing. It's a great joy, an experience that I couldn't have had just being in my own little African village where I grew up. And so it has opened my mind tremendously to engage with all these nationalities and peoples. And it's a very unique characteristic of being in America today.
Yeah, and I think, Sam, just having to sit next to you and listen to you talk, I think if there's anyone out there that is trying to discover their purpose, feel they need to transform their life, or I can't do these things, just listen to this small boy from this African village as to how eloquent he is when he talks and everything that he's accomplished. I think you're a living testimony, Sam, as to what can be achieved here if you believe and you sort of go with the right spirit, the right mindset, and have faith in yourself. That is quite often which we don't see in a lot of our young people today, is having faith in themselves. So,
Absolutely.
Sammy, as we wrap up this second part of this conversation, maybe there's future podcasts in this because we could go for hours, but it's been great. Listen to part of your testimony, you sharing some of the projects that you're working with, and just getting to know you better. So, just in relation to Merge and Shine, what's the best way for people to get hold of you?
Well, you can get a hold of us through our social media, on Instagram, at Merge Twin Cities, same with Facebook at Merge Twin Cities, but then also through our website, mergetwincities.org, and shineintheworld.org. Or you can just Google me, Dr. Sammy Wanyonyi, and
we're going to know how to spell it now. Well, I'll put it in the show notes.
You will have to spell it. That's right.
But it's been an honor and a privilege to talk to you. And I would say that if anyone's listening to this, if this has resonated with you, please share it with people in your network. If there's someone that you feel might be struggling right now, and anything that Sammy has said is going to help them again, please share it with your network. I really believe that through the powerful words that Sammy's spoken about in part 1 and part 2, that people's lives are going to be transformed. So, Sammy, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on your podcast. It's such a wonderful blessing to join you today.
Thank you for joining the Who I Became podcast. To help spread this inspiring story, be sure to share it with your friends, hit the like button, and of course subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on any future episodes. We'd also love to hear how this story impacted you, so leave a comment on whatever platform you're watching us from. To learn more about this episode, our guests, or Simon, head over to the Simon Osimo/podcast and sign up to receive the latest information delivered straight to your inbox. Once again, thank you for joining us for the Who I Became podcast.